Welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about the Latin Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, the extraordinary form, and I can't wait to dig into this topic. It's kind of upsetting that something that's supposed to be the source and summit of Christian life has become politicized and a source of division. Today we're going to separate fact from fancy, from holiness from heresy, with Archbishop Alexander Sample of Portland. But before I introduce him, I want to mention Covenant Eyes. If you've never heard of Covenant Eyes, go to covenanteyes.com. You will find the top-of-the-line pornography software blocker. But it doesn't just block pornography. It sends every page, every word search to a third-party email. So if you want to reduce your porn use down to zero, check out Covenant Eyes. You get 30 days for free if you go to covenanteyes.com, put my name, Patrick, in as a coupon at the checkout. No one has ever circled back and said, Patrick, I got a complaint. This doesn't work. It's really the best in the business. So that's it. covenanteyes.com. My name, Patrick, as the key word coupon gets you 30 days to test drive this bad boy for a month. Okay, today we're going to talk about the extraordinary form with Archbishop Alexander Sample of the Archdiocese of Portland. And that's the topic on this episode of the Patrick Coffin Show. Coming up straight ahead. Do not miss it. As promised, Archbishop Alexander Sample was the 12th Bishop of Marquette, Michigan, now the 11th Archbishop of Portland, Oregon. This past January 2019, he issued a pastoral letter called Sing to the Lord a New Song on the glory and the importance and the indispensable nature of sacred music. Archbishop Sample, so great to talk to you again.
It's great to be with you again, Patrick, and with all of your viewers and listeners.
All right. I noticed you started at 12 at Marquette, 11 at Portland. Are you going for number one?
No, I'm very happy where I am and have no other, my sights on nothing else.
Okay, very good. I think he wants Washington. Just kidding. Let's start with sacred music, and then we'll kind of ease into the topic of the extraordinary form, a little bit of the history and why priests really should be, and lay people of the church should be familiar with both forms of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. When you were the Bishop of Marquette, you wrote a pastoral letter on sacred music, and you've kind of re-updated and kind of bolstered in light of some of the things Pope Francis has said, and in the context of the church in Portland. What was the purpose for writing the first one, but also the updated second one?
Well, I think, I've always had a tremendous interest in the sacred liturgy as a whole. Of course, it's the source and summit of the church's life. And I was inspired really by Pope Benedict XVI when he would often speak about the ars celebrandi of the sacred liturgy, the art of celebrating the sacred liturgy. And for me, probably the most important element of the ars celebrandi, the art of celebration of the sacred liturgy, is the music, which accompanies the liturgical action. So having a desire to do some work in the area of sacred liturgy, I really decided to start there because I think it really is a fundamental issue and a fundamental problem really for the church today in terms of what music we use in the celebration of the sacred liturgy. And as the church teaches, not all forms are acceptable. And yet that seemed to have become the modus operandi really of the church today, is that as long as the lyrics are about God or spirituality, anything goes, any style goes, any instrumentation goes. And I just found that to be, I have found it to be very destructive for the liturgy. So that's where I decided to start my focus on liturgy.
I like the metaphor of body and soul as far as music goes. That the words or the lyrics are kind of like the body, and the musical tone and the melody and so on, the chord structuring are like the soul. So you want to have the two modes fit together in a sort of harmonious, literally harmonious way. Because I was raised, I'm part of the, what I think Bishop Barron called beige Catholicism of the 70s and 80s. And the music was, I have to say, once I was introduced to polyphony and Gregorian chant and some of the beautiful hymns from, say, pre-1962, a lot of it's Drek. Now, by Drek, I mean it's hard to sing, It sounds like a Broadway ballad half the time. And there's a kind of a sentimentality, sort of a syrupy quality to much, not all of it. Not all of it's, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here. But when you walk into SATB form of a Gregorian chant, it's accessible, it's deep, and it not to get too new agey, but it almost puts you in a trance. It's it's like a spiritual reset for your mind. It's calming, and it itself is calm. Were you always an aficionado of music and sacred music in particular?
Well, I've always loved music, and I have very eclectic tastes actually in music. But my interest really in sacred music has started actually in secular university. I was studying to be an engineer, and of course, as an engineer, we had to take those dreaded humanities courses. So I took what looked like a fun, easy course, and that was music appreciation. And I ended up taking all 3 trimesters of that course. And of course, in the study of this history of Western music, where did we start? But we started with Gregorian chant. And then the course moved on to the introduction of sacred polyphony. And it was the first time I had ever heard Gregorian chant. First time I'd ever heard sacred polyphony. And I was immediately taken with it. And it immediately began. I remember there was a group called, what was it, the Musical Heritage Society at the time, and began ordering through the mail recordings of chant and sacred polyphony. And I used to use it even in my prayer as a college student. I really didn't understand the text at the time, quite honestly, except the English translation provided. But Patrick, you said something that really, I think, is what happened to me and what happens to so many who hear this kind of music maybe for the first time. There's even been some studies that it has a psychological even effect in the brain, chant, polyphony, but chant especially. And I just found it lifting my mind and my heart to God in prayer, even though maybe I would not have understood each and every word being sung. There was something about it that brought me into a different place, a sacred place of prayer, really. And I think that's what sacred music is really supposed to help us do.
And doesn't the Latin language have a unique combination of vowels and consonants that's very sonorous? It lends itself, like Italian, to an, I won't say opera, but to musical expression of words.
Yes, and I think even when we sort of take a Gregorian melody and impose it, let's say, upon an English text, it kind of works, but it doesn't work nearly as well as the Latin. I mean, you have to remember that the chant was written for the musical notation of the chant was written for the Latin text of the sacred liturgy, and I think that's the important thing to remember. Is that the music is at the service of the texts of the sacred liturgy, not the other way around. In other words, we don't compose a catchy melody or a tune and then try to find words to fit to that. The whole concept of sacred music and what makes it sacred and holy is its ability to serve the liturgical texts of the Mass itself, including the propers, the introit, the entrance antiphon, the communion antiphon, the offertory, along with the ordinary of the Mass that we sing every Sunday. So I think that has to be kept in mind, that the music serves the text, not the other way around.
You mentioned in your pastoral letter some of the qualities that make sacred music sacred. And if I'm not mistaken, there's another one that you mention. It's not just the tone and the sound, but I guess it's the identification of the lyrics of each stanza with the readings. Nowadays, right. There's sort of an add-on. We've got a glory and praise song. We just kind of insert it here because, well, we have to have some kind of recessional. But It was a much more organic unity, was it not? Sacred music with the Old Mass.
Absolutely, and that's I call it the way I express it in the letter is, we are not called to sing songs at Mass. But we are called to sing the Mass. And that's a very, very important distinction. I mean, typically what we do is, we find the 4 hymns, the entrance hymn, the offertory hymn, the communion hymn, the final hymn, and we're done planning the liturgy. Well, the point is that the church has already planned the liturgy for us. we have to prepare it. And so the texts that I'm referring to, that where I refer to that relate to even to the readings of the day, or the particular liturgical feast that we're celebrating, or the liturgical season that we're in, those texts, the propers of the Mass, like I said, the entrance antiphon, the offertory antiphon, the communion antiphon, those texts are particular for that Sunday or even that feast day celebration. So those are the texts that the Church wants us to sing. And instead we set those aside and we go to the very last option the Church gives us in the listing of all what should be sung at these moments, and that's the hymn.
Interesting. So when the great masters were commissioned by the Church to compose a Mass, it was a specific Mass. It was this Sunday in ordinary time, or for this solemnity or feast.
Well, most of the masses that we would be familiar with, the composed masses of the great artists, whether of sacred polyphony or maybe the classical era, they wrote primarily for the ordinary of the Mass, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei.
I see.
They didn't normally write because they wanted those melodies or those compositions to be used at any Mass. But there are some composers who did actually also compose for the propers of the Mass. This is particularly the case in a Requiem Mass. If you look at any great composer's musical composition for a Requiem Mass, you'll find that the propers of the Requiem Mass are also set to music as well. The introit, even in the Dies Irae. You think of some of the great Requiem Masses, Fauré's Requiem, for example.
I can put a link in patrickcoffin.media, something I saw on the CBC a couple of years ago. You may have seen this. It's how the Dies Irae, the main four notes, appear in dozens and dozens of Hollywood films. It's astounding how that kind of basic building block of the Day of Wrath will show up in to accompany Hollywood movies. Also, I'll put that link in there.
Patrick, one of the things I'd just like to quickly point out is, you mentioned the qualities, and that's something that I point out from in my letter, the three essential qualities for what makes music suitable for the sacred liturgy. And these come from, again, Pope St. Pius X's motu proprio, which was law for the Church at the time, tra le sollicitudini. And it's sacredness, which is its closeness, its service of the liturgical text, its beauty and its artistic quality, and its universality. And it's interesting, I get sort of sometimes criticized for quoting such an old pope, and that was so long ago. But just very recently, at the end of September, Pope Francis addressed in Rome the Schola Cantorum of the Italian Association of St. Cecilia, and he spoke about the role of sacred music. And he himself quotes Pope St. Pius X in these same three qualities, and even mentions the paradigm, if you will, for all sacred music, which is Gregorian chant. So even the current Pope leading the Church today understands the importance of sacred music as the Church understands. It's not as anybody's individual taste might prefer, let's say. And
Archbishop, those qualities are objective. We now have sort of bought the misunderstanding that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. For the qualities of in this case, music, they're objective qualities. And if you think that gangster rap or jazz from the 20s would be a suitable music form, then there's something perhaps deficient in your understanding of what the Mass is to begin with.
Right. We make it very subjective. It's what I like. It's what I want. It's what pleases me, which becomes very, very self-absorbed and really very, self-willed, if you will, rather than seeking what does the Church want for us? What has the Church provided for us? What has the Church developed over centuries upon centuries upon centuries? What does the Church ask of us? That's where we have to be humble and put ourselves at the service of the sacred liturgy. It's not ours to mold and form the way we want it. The liturgy is given to us. It's entrusted to us. And it's our responsibility, to be faithful, to what is given to us. But, you mentioned all these different forms. Having spent a lot of time in the Midwest, there is such a thing as the polka mass.
Right. Let's have a moment of silence for the polka mass, shall we?
I mean, I've never attended one, but I saw a video of one once. And I say you haven't lived until you've heard the Lamb of God sung to the melody of the beer barrel polka. And I'm not joking. I'm not joking.
Surely you're joking, Your Excellency. Man. Well, that you've taken away one of my questions, and that is the proper pronunciation of the Pope Pius X motu proprio. My mnemonic cue for it is that it starts like it looks like tra-la-la, which is music. Sollecitudini? Sollecitudini?
Tra le sollecitudini.
Sollecitudini. Okay, very good. Now, I read that. It's not long, and it's a very bracing read. That Pope was quite the wordsmith. Not a word wasted, and he kind of gets down to brass tacks very quickly. And I think anyone who loves music and who loves going to Mass should read that. Archbishop Sample, isn't it a fallacy to dismiss something because of its ancient quality or when it first arose? I mean, whether something started last Tuesday or, I don't know, 33 A.D., shouldn't the point be whether it's true and beautiful and good?
That's exactly right. And it goes back to that whole idea of there being objective principles. We don't have to wonder about what's appropriate for the sacred liturgy and what isn't appropriate. There are these objective truths, and because something is old, doesn't mean that it's from the past. I often think that a lot of people operate, it seems, as if the church sort of hit a reset button at the Second Vatican Council, and we sort of rebooted the church at that time, and so anything that smacks of preconciliar forms, preconciliar music, is almost anathema to some people. And I don't understand the knee-jerk reaction it gets sometimes. I think people maybe have some images or experiences of the church before the council that maybe for them are very negative, that they somehow associate with these former forms and former styles of music, so that anytime they think about it or hear about it, it creates that reaction against it. But the Second Vatican Council itself, in the document on the sacred liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, talked about preserving the treasury of sacred music in the church that has been handed on to us, while at the same time encouraging contemporary composition of sacred music that is in harmony with, in continuity with that sacred tradition, and it wouldn't be a rupture from it, as Pope Benedict so would often speak about.
Mm-hmm. This is maybe a nice hinge to talk about the Mass per se. There's a great misunderstanding about the Second Vatican Council that I like the image that you gave of reboot. It's like this is Catholic Church 201 somehow. There's some deep flaws before 1962 that everybody missed until the magical Vatican II came along. But Sacrosanctum Concilium does not call for the abandonment of Latin or even proposing a different form. That was something that Paul VI did on his own, and say 4 years later after the council closed, correct?
I think the council did call, there's no doubt that the council did call for a reform, if you will, of the sacred liturgy, a tweaking of the sacred liturgy, and it called for some specific things that it wanted to see in the reform. The debate is what actually happened after the council, when the concilium was formed to implement what many interpreted the Second Vatican Council to call for. And that's where I am one of many who think that some things really got off track there in the implementation of the council, not in what the council said. I wish people would really go back and read Sacrosanctum Concilium. And again, it's not a difficult read, but it really gives you a very clear idea what the council fathers were calling for. I mean, not only does it not abolish Latin, but it calls for the preservation of the Latin language and calls for the laity to be taught how to actively sing the parts of the Mass in Latin which pertain to them. Mm-hmm. The Second Vatican Council never called for, let's say, the elimination of communion rails from our churches. The Second Vatican Council, many are surprised to know, never called for the altar or the celebration of the Mass to be turned to face the people rather than facing God or facing liturgical East, the direction from which Christ comes. So there's a lot of things that happened in the Reform after Vatican II that, quite frankly, Vatican II never called for, and I think, quite honestly, many of them just never even envisioned.
Do you think that the word discontinuity, or is it merely tension, that describes the reforms called for in Sacrosanctum Concilium and what became the Mass of Paul VI, or the Novus Ordo Missae? Because now we have almost two cultures of the Church. We have a much smaller culture that's attached to the extraordinary form from 1962, and then we have the more broad way of celebrating the Mass, which is the ordinary form. How did Paul VI, in his personal reforming of the Church, so outdo what the Council itself called for? Outdo might not be the right word.
Go beyond, maybe.
Go beyond, yeah.
Well, I think that, again, the Holy Father, Saint, Paul VI, was taking his. I mean, I don't know really, quite honestly, enough of the history of his involvement in the Reform. I know the Concilium, the group, sort of given the responsibility for implementing the Council, I'm sure would run things by him. But there's a lot of stories floating around where I think a lot of things that happened, Paul VI wasn't even maybe fully aware of or supportive of. There's a famous story told about, Pentecost used to have an octave, which just like the Easter octave, just like the octave of Christmas. In other words, Pentecost Sunday would have a whole week of octave afterwards. Now, on Monday after Pentecost, we go back to ordinary time, and it's green. And the story is told, it's a true story, that Pope Paul VI walked into the sacristy to celebrate Mass on Monday after Pentecost and saw the green vestments laid out, and he said, what's with the green vestments? It's supposed to be red. This is the octave of Pentecost. He says, no, Holy Father, the new liturgy doesn't have an octave for Pentecost. And he said, well, who did that? And he says, well, Holy Father, you did. In approving, the work of the Concilium. I think that I would put it this way, Patrick. This is just my personal opinion, and it's just my opinion. I think certainly in practice, and often in times, the way the new Missal of Paul VI is celebrated, I think there is discontinuity, and I think we have to be honest about that. I think when we compare the 1962 celebration of Holy Mass to, let's say, the typical celebration of the Missal of Paul VI, you can see a discontinuity. It's evident. And I think, Pope Benedict, this is what he was trying to get at in Summorum Pontificum when he allowed for a greater availability of the extraordinary form, what he calls it, that he said there should be no rupture between what has gone before and what comes after. There should always be, he called it a hermeneutic of reform in continuity with the past. And I think that we can see, not just in the celebration itself, but quite honestly, I've come to think that even the form itself, just as it is in the Missal, there's some things that have created some discontinuity with what has gone before. And that's why I think Pope Benedict talked about this need for a mutual enrichment, that the new Missal needs to be enriched by some of what was in the old Missal, and maybe some of those things recovered. And he used to talk about things like the prayers, the offertory prayers, for instance, which were really stripped down in the new Mass, but which the old Mass, those offertory prayers are so beautiful and speak so powerfully of the mystery that's being celebrated, especially the holy sacrifice of the Mass. There was even talk of restoring at least some of the prayers at the foot of the altar. We've got a ways to go. It's going to be interesting to see how this movement goes into the future.
Archbishop, I don't want to fall into the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy that says that, just because the Second Vatican Council happened, we can assign blame to it alone. But there does seem to be some causal connection between the massive eclipse of faith in the Catholic Church and all of the changes in the turbulent wake of the Council. Do you envision a future kind of fusion of the two Masses, the extraordinary form and the ordinary, to a singular celebration of the Mass that is not divided, that does, in fact, obey in letter and spirit what Sacrosanctum Concilium calls for?
Well, as you say, I don't have a crystal ball. I really don't know what the future holds. I'm going to be very interested to watch it. And it may not come to a resolution, quite honestly, Patrick, in our lifetime. I know that most, I would say, of the people who are deeply attached to the 1962 Missal, that's the Mass they want. They're really not all that interested in a fusion, if you will, or a reform. We used to talk about a reform of the reform. We're told we're not supposed to use those terms anymore, I guess. But I think Cardinal Sarah speaks more about a reform in continuity, or a reconciliation. And Pope Benedict spoke of this too, a reconciliation of the Church with her past. And so a lot of those folks, I don't know. But I think on the other side, if you will, for the ordinary form and the Missal of Paul VI, I think there's a great hope among many of us that there will be a re-examination of really the form of the Mass that we have typically in every parish on Sunday. I think, quite honestly, I think that was Pope Benedict's dream and hope, was that there would be this, he did use the words reform of the reform, that we would have to take another look at what we lost in the reform of the liturgy, especially, yes, in its form itself, but also especially in its celebration and how it is celebrated. And because there is this discontinuity. So I know, because the ordinary form is the Mass that I celebrate, 99.9% of the time. And I would very much like to see a re-examination of that liturgy and a reform of that liturgy that would recapture so much of what we have lost from the previous form, that sense of transcendence, the sense of awe and mystery. And by mystery, I don't mean we don't know what's going on. I mean the sense of divine mystery, of God's tremendous love poured out for us in the Paschal mystery, which we represent in the Holy Mass, that liturgy that would truly be a transcendent experience where people step out of the secular world, off the street, into the church, into the sacred liturgy, and they're in an entirely different realm of the sacred. And, things like the music, are going to be different, completely different. And this is actually something Pope Francis mentioned in this recent talk, is that, it has to be different from what we experience in the wider world. So I don't know what's going to happen. My hope is more for the ordinary form and the possibilities there of some re-examination and maybe some reform of these forms. And what happens with the 1962 Missal, we'll have to wait and see.
Maybe my proposal is the worst of both worlds, because you're going to have two irritated groups, the ones that don't want to change and the ones that are happy with the status quo.
It could be.
The old the 1962 Missal and the way the Latin Mass tends to be celebrated, it's almost impossible to get in some kind of liturgical abuse. I mean, saying the red, doing the black, it's just so simple. And at the end, no one claps. And there's this tremendous, I don't want to use the word otherworldly because that sounds a bit Twilight Zone-ish, but there's something entirely other going on. Do you find Catholics are afraid of the notion of mystery? They just don't want it's like an occult, strange topic, rather than see it, the Mass, as the mystery of God embracing us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that my greater sense of things and why some people are sort of turned off by the form, if you will, in which the Mass was celebrated previously. And you're right. I mean, there's just no room for any liturgical abuse in the old form. There's no room for, as we say, creativity and toying with the liturgy or tinkering with it or making it express something that we wanted to express. I don't know if people are, it's so much that they're afraid of the sense of mystery or transcendence. But I think what's happened is the liturgical experience for so many people has become kind of a very emotional experience, a very human experience, where I go to Mass. I mean, we have to remember the purpose of the sacred liturgy is first to give glory to God, and secondly for the sanctification of the people. But I think I think a lot of people go because they want to be made to feel good. I sometimes I've heard the expression used, kind of the therapeutic liturgy.
Yes.
Where I go because I want good music that's going to emotionally, move me, and I want to feel this sense of community and which is, I don't want to downplay the importance of the sense of the community gathered at worship, but it's more like that horizontal, as we hear about it, the horizontal experience where it's me and the community, and we're all just feeling very good here, and this is a wonderful, uplifting, emotional experience for me. But the vertical dimension of worship, the vertical dimension of the sense of the awesomeness of God, is lost, and I don't know. I think we've just become so accustomed to it, and quite honestly, I think we have imitated in many ways the many Protestant forms of worship. We have our own unique liturgical history. We have our own unique liturgical tradition. The way the Mass was celebrated prior to the Council clearly communicated what we believed about the Mass, that this is the representation of the sacrifice of Calvary for us and for our salvation. And so that was very clear. In the new Mass, at least as how it's typically celebrated, you don't get the sense of this is a renewal of the sacrifice of Christ. You get more of a sense it's a renewal of the Last Supper. We're just having this meal experience, this sacred meal experience, and that's kind of what I grew up with. I didn't even know the Mass was a sacrifice until I was well into college, and that's after 12 years of Catholic school education.
Altar as table, Mass as meal.
Right, and so I think people have just become so accustomed to that. It's become familiar to them. It's become comforting to them, perhaps. And I think that's why it's jarring for some people to experience the older form. But what I would point out is that young people are discovering the extraordinary form, the liturgical tradition, and they're falling head over heels in love with it. I'm often told, usually by, I'm at the tail end of the baby boom generation, but the aging baby boomers, I'm often told, you're going to drive all the young people right out of the church with this, liturgical, more traditional approach. And I just want to say, well, you're not talking to the young people that are talking to me, because just the other night I met a young man, 30-something, who's just thanking me profusely, and this happens all the time. Everywhere I go, I run into this, and I have to point out it's not like we're exactly keeping the young people in the church as it is with what we're doing.
Exactly, just addiction to the status quo, which has been broken for some time now.
Right, and I think that we need to be open. We're all about openness, right, and change. Well, how about being open to the fact that maybe some things went a little bit off track, and maybe some things need to be reexamined and restored.
I remember the late, great Billy Graham was interviewed by, I think it was Diane Sawyer, and she said, Reverend Graham, you've been accused of wanting to turn the clock back 500 years. He goes, well, if that's true, I've failed because I wanted to turn it back 2,000 years. I can't help but think that music can be a kind of exit lane out of the church because of the similarity to Protestant praise and worship forms. And they go to, say, a megachurch, and it is an emotionally engaging thing. People are kind of fired up, and that becomes maybe a rationale to drift from the Catholic moral life as well. The problem seems to feed it, like a snake eating its own tail. Likewise, when you encounter something out of the normal fare that we've had for the last 50 years, it's like encountering Dom Perignon for the first time, when you just thought there was, cream soda and Kool-Aid. I hope that doesn't offend any musician sensibilities, because there's a subjective element here too. But music can be a bane or a boon. Am I overplaying it? Is that too much of a caricature?
No, I think that I read an essay. Oh, this was years ago. I think even before I was bishop. I read an essay by a Protestant minister who had actually a great respect for the Catholic tradition and wasn't anti-Catholic in any way. And he said it was an appeal to Catholics, not to do what we do as Protestants.
Hmm.
He was urging Catholics to stay faithful to our tradition, stay faithful to what you do. And he was talking about things like Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony and our more, well, if we call it sacred, according to how the church understands that style of music. He says, stay faithful to what you have. That's yours. And he said, it was very interesting. He said, because, don't imitate what we do. He says, because quite honestly, we do it better than you.
Hmm.
And
That's interesting. It's an admission, and he's probably right.
yeah, so I think, Patrick, you're not far off the mark that if our liturgy looks just more and more and more like Protestant liturgy or evangelical church liturgy with all of this hyped up music and people get all emotionally worked up, if they do it better over there, and especially if, according to this recent Pew research study on Catholics' belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, if you already don't believe in the real presence, and they kind of do it better over there, what I like, then yeah, I think there's a danger, at least, of denominational drift, if you will.
I'll try to find that if you can. Maybe we can put our heads together and put it in the notes.
It
Sounds
was years
like
ago.
years ago. Okay.
It was years ago.
My gosh, there's I've got 9 different possible avenues to follow up there. So here's a Protestant musician saying to Catholics, "Be who you are."
Right. Yeah, be faithful to who you are, and that's yours. That's your tradition. That's what's sustained you for 2,000 years. An appeal not to abandon what we have.
And how many of the lyrics of post Second Vatican Council praise and worship songs really water down things like the real presence in the Eucharist, the authority of the Church, the role of the communion of saints? It's a very kind of flattened, bowdlerized version. This is interesting. I don't know if you've noticed the Glory and Praise model, or that whole collection of songs, has since been updated again in light of feminist language. So you have this doubly bowdlerized, pushing of the envelope in one direction. Let me ask you. Let's, if we can, explode some myths. Myth number one. This kind of gets under my skin a little bit. Well, in the old Mass, the priest had his back to the people.
Yeah, this is one of the most troubling misnomers, really, with regard to the way the liturgy was celebrated. The whole idea was never, ever, that the priest had turned his back to the people, as if, folks, I don't want you to have anything to do with what I'm doing here, and I'm going to keep this hidden from you. The whole idea has always been that the priest and the people both face the same direction in giving worship and praise and offering sacrifice, the sacrifice of the Mass, to God. Traditionally, the altar faced the east, and the east was the direction from which, it was believed that Christ ascended to the Father in the east, and that he would come again in glory at the end of time, coming from the east, the rising sun. Mm-hmm. This whole imagery, and Pope Benedict speaks about this so beautiful in his wonderful work on the spirit of the liturgy. So the idea was that at that point in the Mass, especially, that the priest actually turns and faces the same way as the people. He's joining them in the same direction of prayer as the head of the body, leading them in prayer, offering the sacrifice. And even if the church didn't actually face east, it's kind of what we call liturgical east. Mm-hmm. The concept is at least there, where priest and people together are focused now on God, especially at that point of the Mass, in offering the sacrifice. And quite honestly, I think that the turning of the celebration of the Mass to face the people is one of the most influential things on what has happened to a whole new understanding, really, of the liturgy, and a loss of that sense of the sacrifice of the Mass.
That's one of the ironies, isn't it? That the Latin Mass is sometimes accused of being kind of over-introverted and privatized, where it's about the individual. But when the priest is celebrating the Mass ad orientem, leading the people facing in one direction, the liturgy itself is no longer about the personality of the priest. Mm-mm. That in persona Christi really comes to the fore. Not that the priest literally disappears, of course not. But nowadays, when now this may be a terrible stereotype, but in many suburban settings, the ordinary form of the Mass, it seems more like in persona JC, meaning Johnny Carson, where the priest just can't help himself, whether it's liturgical innovations or updates or witty asides. It's almost impossible to do that if you are celebrating the ordinary form, the extraordinary form.
No, that's very true, and really, I mean, the priest himself doesn't disappear, but mm-hmm. his personality, who that man is up there as an individual, doesn't matter anymore, because the priest ministers in the Holy Mass in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, in persona Christi Capitis, in the person of Christ the head. Yeah. By the way, that's the language of the Second Vatican Council. I would remind all of us that's not some preconciliar notion. That's how the Second Vatican Council described the role of the priest. And mm-hmm. so who the individual is, what his own personality is, what he looks like, disappears. And he is simply now offering with the people, the sacrifice of the Mass to Almighty God. And I think that, that whole concept, there is a temptation. And I'm sorry, I've been a priest for almost 29 and a half years. Mm-hmm. And, again, 99% of the Masses that I celebrate are facing the people and always have been. But there's always a great, I don't say a temptation, but there's an awareness that, everybody's looking at you and the focus somehow is on you. Mm-hmm. And that's so wrong. That's why Pope Benedict said that even when the churches can't, because Pope Benedict called for restoration of ad orientem celebration. Mm-hmm. But he said, that's not possible. Place the crucifix on the altar, so that everybody is focused on the crucifix, on Christ, on what's happening here. Mm-hmm. It's not this mutual gazing at each other and interaction with each other. That's why my eyes are always lifted when I'm praying versus populum, facing the people, because I heard it. There's a cute story told once when a priest celebrated Mass ad orientem, and this happened in England, I'm told. And a woman came into the sacristy after Mass to complain to the priest. He says, "Father, you turned your back on me during the celebration of Mass." He says, "Well, my dear," he says, "at that point, I wasn't speaking to you." In other words, right. The prayers are directed to the Father at mm-hmm. that point. So we all turn to talk to our Father in heaven.
I saw a meme once online. It was kind of a what's the word? It was an illustrated snapshot of the priest facing ad orientem, and someone in the congregation is thinking, "I like my pilots to be facing, straight ahead when I fly."
True.
There's something to that. Here's another myth. Well, if you want to be a purist, you Latin masters, then why don't you have the Mass celebrated in Aramaic or Hebrew, which is what Jesus probably said the Mass at the Last Supper?
Yeah, I think that, certainly the language of Jesus at the Last Supper was not the Latin language. But, we have to remember that Latin, at the time Latin began to be employed in the sacred liturgy, it was the vernacular of the people.
Yeah, people forget the Vulgate means vulgar, right? Or common, St. Jerome's translation.
It was the common language, even though certainly a lot of people, didn't have an education and would not perhaps have been able to read or write the Latin language. At least in some form, the Latin language was the vernacular. It was the common language of the people. Mm-hmm. So again, the Church early on wanted to make the liturgy accessible, to those who were, going to be praying, with the liturgy. Of course, then over time, Latin became the mother tongue, if you will, of the whole church. And it was that unifying element, really, for the whole church, that this was our mother tongue. This was a language that we all, and people quite honestly used to understand Latin much better. I mean, my father was born and raised an Episcopalian, went to public school, but he knew more Latin than I did, before I started studying it formally, and I'd gone through Catholic school. But it's that sacred language that is preserved, and that unites us. It unites us not only globally now, in the here and the now as a universal church, but it also unites us with the communion of saints who have gone before us. The first time I celebrated the extraordinary form, all by myself in my little private chapel when I was trying to learn it on my own, I suddenly was overwhelmed by the sense that this is the Mass that nourished the faith of my mother growing up. This is the Mass that nourished the faith of my grandparents. Mm-hmm. I have a great devotion to the first bishop of my previous diocese, Marquette, the Venerable Frederick Barraga. Yes. The first bishop of Marquette, who's prayed for his cause. It looks like we have a potential miracle again, and awesome. Maybe he'll be beatified. But anyway, the sense came to me: this is the Mass that my beloved Venerable Frederick Barraga celebrated. There was a sense of great connection with the saints of the past, with our history. So it connects us in the time here and now across the world, but it also connects us across time through the centuries of the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. As you were mentioning your family and their being nurtured by the Mass, I immediately thought of Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta. From her childhood, for decades, was Latin Mass, and it worked out pretty well for her and for us. I understand that when the apostles preached the gospel and Mass was celebrated in the Mesopotamian and the ancient world, that Greek was sort of the official language, and we see the little remnant of that in the Kyrie eleison.
The Kyrie eleison, yeah. So that's the one, that's the one element in the liturgy that is celebrated, is that preserves that Greek connection, if you will, to the New Testament itself. Even though Jesus obviously spoke Aramaic, the New Testament was written in Greek. Mm-hmm. And so that connection to the biblical language is also still there in the liturgy through the Kyrie and Kyrie eleison, Christi eleison.
I've been doing some reading, and it's apparently the year 190 under Pope Victor, when the Church in Rome changed from Greek to Latin, which is a long, long way away, even before the time of St. Pius X. Imagine. I've asked you this before, Archbishop. Can you share with my viewers how you learned the Latin Mass? Because it wasn't offered. I mean, even up until 1967, Catholic priests were trained in Latin. And so there was a kind of at least familiarity, even if you weren't a Latin scholar. But you didn't learn it in seminary. How did you look this up and do it DIY? DIY. I'd always had an interest in the traditional Latin Mass, to be honest. Even as a college student, a secular college student studying engineering, I started doing I really did more learning about my Catholic faith after 12 years of Catholic schooling than I did during those years. And I was doing a lot of reading, and I discovered the traditional Latin Mass. And I remember it's still out there available. There was a great video done, a movie, it was a film done, I think back maybe in the 30s or 40s, narrated by the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, long before he was a bishop. And it was a black and white scratchy video of solemn high Mass. I think it might have been for Easter or one of the feasts during the Easter season, with the Mundelein seminary choir singing, and I was just so enamored with it. It was so beautiful. The solemnity of it, the ritual of it, the precision of it, the music. I was so touched by it. I'm an engineering college student, but it was like, well, my attitude was, well, that's gone. That's gone. I'll never see that again. I'll never experience that. The only group celebrating the traditional Latin Mass in those days were the Society of St. Pius X, Archbishop Lefebvre's group. So I figured, well, this is never going to be a part of my life. Mm-hmm. I became a priest. I still had, of course, an interest in it, but it was, again, it's like, well, there's
I'm a priest of today, and there's no need for me or no opportunity for me to celebrate this Mass. There were some priests that had the permission to say it under the motu proprio Ecclesia Dei, but you had to get individual permission from the bishop, and you had to have a reason. Well, I didn't have any real reason other than I was kind of found it interesting and beautiful and would have loved to learn it, but I never, bothered learning it as a priest. I studied canon law, so I had to study some Latin, so I got much better in my Latin facility during those years. But after I became a bishop, again, there was no real interest for me other than a personal interest. But then in 2008, when the Holy Father, Pope Benedict XVI, came out with the motu proprio, Summorum Pontificum, where he said that bishops must be generous in providing the traditional form of the liturgy for those Catholics who are attached to it, the thought went through my mind, well, I am a bishop of the Latin Church. There are now two forms of the sacred liturgy, the ordinary form, which I'm very familiar with, and the extraordinary form. I felt it my duty, quite honestly, to learn the extraordinary form. And not long after the motu proprio, people began asking for it anyway, and I knew I would have to provide it. So I ordered the books, I ordered some videos, and I just kept watching and practicing and all of that, and learned it all by myself in my little private chapel. And I remember the first Mass I celebrated, the actual Mass. I did a lot of dry Masses, just sort of practicing, but not really ending to celebrate Mass. But the first time I actually celebrated Mass, it was just a simple little daily low Mass, so to speak. I think it took me an hour to celebrate because I kept having to look at the cheat sheet, so to speak, of what I was supposed to do next. It is a little daunting at first to learn it, but once you've learned it, and now I celebrate it publicly, on occasion, maybe, I don't know, 2-3 times a year, maybe. But I also privately celebrate it once in a while, just to keep limber, if you will, with it.
Yeah.
Now it's so natural. It's as natural to me now as the ordinary form, to be honest. So any priests out there who are afraid to learn it or think it's too much to learn, or don't be afraid to give it a try. It's once you have it, it's like riding a bike. You just it becomes natural to you. In fact, sometimes in the celebration of the ordinary form, I'll catch myself almost doing something, from the extraordinary form in the new liturgy, and vice versa. Once in a while, I slip and do something or start to do something in the extraordinary form that, oh, wait a minute, no, that's how we do it in the new Mass.
Right. I remember the words VHS and eBay. Am I misremembering?
VHS.
Did you order VHS tapes on basically a how-to from eBay? No?
Come on, Patrick. They were DVDs. Come on.
Oh, excuse me. See,
you were in the modern age.
I thought you owed Pius the 10th money. Sorry, you're not that old. Okay.
The video of the High Mass that I was talking about, narrated by Fulton Sheen, that was on VHS.
I found it, by the way, on YouTube. It's called Pray the Mass from 1942.
Yeah, it was called the Pray the Mass movement.
Oh,
and it was
right.
a whole movement. It was a whole movement at that time. This is when hand missals became very common in use, because what they were trying to do is, it was really part of the liturgical movement. They were trying to get people to pray the Mass. In other words, to really follow along with the Mass. That's what the Second Vatican Council primarily meant when she said that we wanted full, active, conscious participation of the people. It wasn't that the Church was saying, well, the people then always have to be saying, doing, or singing something, but we want people to be engaged in mind and heart with what's happening in this Mass. And so the Pray the Mass movement with the hand missals was to get people really plugged in and praying along, with the Mass.
Yeah, beautiful. Directed by the Reverend Joseph Rush. The Schola Cantorum of Mundelein. Yeah, I'm going to put the link inside patrickhoffman.media. I understand there was a slight difference of opinion between Venerable Pius XII and St. Paul VI with respect to things like saying the Rosary during the Mass. Because on one level, it does not seem to be active participation. Rather, you're kind of in a parallel way praying the Rosary. Paul VI sort of frowned on that.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts on that?
well, I must say that I would have to probably side with Saint Paul VI on that. I think that that was the whole point, is that the church in the liturgical movement, in the liturgical reform, and I think it's clearly one of the things that the Second Vatican Council really intended, was that we wanted the folks gathered at Mass to be actively, consciously, prayerfully participating in the Holy Mass, so that we're really engaged in the liturgical action,
Mm-hmm.
and not doing other devotions at that time. I mean, I'm all in favor of the other devotions. Believe me, I'm a big rosary, advocate myself.
Mm-hmm.
But during the celebration of Mass is not the proper time, and I think that the Church is teaching us to be doing that. We should be really actively engaged, and again, the missals. If you look at some old missals, in fact, hand missals that people would have at Mass, there would even be prayers that were recommended for people to say during different parts of the Mass, especially during the offertory prayers. Things like when the priest is preparing the chalice and the paten, there'd be prayers like, Lord, place my life and my joys and my sufferings on the paten with that host. Lord, I pour my life into that chalice with the wine. In other words, this idea of uniting my life to the sacrifice that's about to be offered in the Holy Mass, the representation of Christ's sacrifice. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the idea. We want people to be really engaged, and I think that's very valid, and I think that's a laudable aspiration and intention of the Council.
I think it's a good sign to see Roman missals out now. That there's a beautiful leather-bound one you can get. In fact, I'll put a link there as well. It would be a good Christmas gift, because going from the Missal with its solidity and its heft, its kind of quasi-permanence, compared to the Missalettes, I heard a phrase years ago, Missalettes for Christianettes. There's something throwaway about the sort of flimsy Missalette. I don't know what your views on that are.
Yeah, well, I think that most people don't own a missal, a proper hand missal, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so for those folks who don't, and again, probably 99% don't, then I think to have something for them available. But yeah, there's a beauty to the book. I'm a big proponent of the beauty of the book, and I don't know if there's a theology of the book, but there's a spirituality of the book. Yeah. The Missal is a sacred book. This has the sacred text, the altar missal, but then a hand missal as well. I mean, I get caught sometimes in a pinch having to pray the divine office, let's say, on my phone.
Yeah.
Using
I use iBreviary in a pinch.
iBreviary,
Yeah.
But I most of the time I always try to use the book. In fact, in the recent, there's the new book just out right now by Cardinal Sarah. The day is now far spent. Mm-hmm. He urges priests in there, because of all this technological age and getting caught up in technology and all of that. He urges priests, please, 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 pray from the breviary. Don't pray from your phones. There's something about the book.
There is. I wonder often what Marshall McLuhan would say about the difference between reading text off a pixelated, million points of light screen versus black ink on a white page. It's definitely it's difficult to articulate why it's different, but it certainly is. Archbishop Sample, just a couple final questions. Do you think that the slow reactionary path taken by the Society of Pius X, that led to the 1988 excommunications, kind of put the kibosh on more broad interest in the extraordinary form? Because in the popular mind, maybe it's just a shellacking in the press for long enough. In the popular Catholic imagination, the Latin Mass is seen identified with kind of rebellious, reactionary. Anything after 1962 is bad. Everything before it was good.
Yeah, I think that I think probably there's some truth to that association that I think people make in their mind to traditionally minded Catholics. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's nothing. I I think, you know, every movement has its extremists, let's put it that way. And, you know, and I encounter, you know, people all over the place and from all different sorts of ideologies that can become a little extreme. I find in the traditional Latin Mass community, there are some people that are a little bit out there, you know, in terms of their theology and their ecclesiology and that. But I think the mainstream of the traditional Latin Mass folks that I know, I find that there's primarily, quite honestly, two groups, generally speaking. There's an older generation that has a great attachment to it because they have a memory of it. And they have a greater love and appreciation for it, and it's not a nostalgia in a bad way, but a love for it, and so they're so grateful to have this availability back. But then there's a younger generation. It's this younger generation that have never experienced it. You know, I had a bishop once say to me, "I just don't understand why all of these young people are so attracted to the Latin Mass. They've never experienced it. They never grew up with it. I just don't understand it." And I said to him, I said, that's exactly the question you should be asking. Why are they attracted to it? What is it that they're not finding, at least in their typical celebration of the ordinary form, that they are finding here? You know, maybe the church should really be looking at this question. And I find these people they're just good, solid Catholics who love Jesus, who love their neighbor, and who just have this great love and appreciation for a liturgy that is beautiful, that is transcendent, that is, it satisfies something in their soul that a lot of young families at these masses, I'm telling you.
No, I've seen it myself. I'm very friendly with the FSSP, and our parish is administered by the Norbertines, so I'm very familiar with it. It is, as you say earlier, it takes a while for it to land on you. The timing is different. It's different, slower movements, and of course, if you don't speak Latin at all, it's a bit foreign. But you know, the Missal provides either a prayer or the English equivalent. You can follow along, and my good friend Monsignor Charles Pope seems to think that the interest in the Latin Mass is kind of topped out where it is. I'm not sure if that's right. I do see this resurgent interest among young Catholics who've never seen it before, and that in turn leads to solid, and this is anecdotal evidence, but solid families and almost overwhelming an appreciation for large families. They go together.
Yeah, no, it's true. I see it very, very, very easily and close up. I don't know, you know, and I have a lot of respect for Monsignor Pope, and he's probably much more knowledgeable about this than I am. I can say here in Western Oregon, I only see an increase in interest in the traditional Latin Mass. In fact, I just approved recently, or I shouldn't say approved it, because I'm supposed to provide the Mass when people ask for it, but I was able to provide a weekly Mass, an additional weekly Mass in the extraordinary form here in the southern part of the Archdiocese of Portland. We have a couple of places that do it here in the greater metro area of Portland. We have a parish that does it in Salem, further south, but all the way down in the Medford, which is in the far southern part of this archdiocese. There's a very large group down there interested, and I was finally able to provide them with a weekly Mass. They had a monthly Mass. So I keep getting more I ran into a young woman at a dinner the other night who was just pleading with me, you know, to make, you know, the Mass more available. She said, "I'll travel anywhere," you know, so. I'm not seeing a waning of interest here. I would say just probably the opposite.
I'm sure any priest, including yourself, Archbishop, if you decided to make it a regular thing in your cathedral or anywhere, if you say it, they will come, to paraphrase Field of Dreams.
Yes.
Well, I always learn a ton when you're on, Archbishop. I fondly remember our live exploits at Catholic Answers in San Diego in front of a crowd. And
that was a very intimidating experience.
Well, you didn't look intimidated. So many church leaders are kind of media phobic for various reasons. You're certainly not one of them. So thanks for your priesthood. I want to recommend, if you haven't heard of this, and also to my viewers, and it's an essay from Homiletic and Pastoral Review by my friend and guest, Dr. Paul Vitz, and his son, Father Daniel Vitz. And it's on, I forget the precise title, something like Liturgical Abuse and Priestly Narcissism. It's a really fascinating study of, you know, the fact that so many ways of celebrating the ordinary form become almost self-worship, and through things like the music. So I'll put that on the link as well. Thanks for telling me about Pray the Mass. I'll put that in there as well in the link. My spiritual father, soon to be blessed Fulton Sheen.
Yes, praise God.
Yeah. Can we get your Episcopal blessing on us, our staff, and our listeners?
Yes. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
And may the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down upon all of you, your families, your loved ones, and be with you this day and forever. Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much. Godspeed, Archbishop Sample.
God bless you too.
Join Coffin Nation. Go to coffinnation.com. Get on board with the largest culture restoring community in the world. Now in 18 countries and counting. Coffinnation.com. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.